The manila envelope trembled in my hands as I sat in my rental car, staring at the lakeside cabin that had been my sanctuary for the past 7 years. Through the panoramic windows, I could see movement, a flash of red hair that didn't belong to anyone in my family, my husband's laughter mingling with a woman's voice I didn't recognize. The vacation home we'd lovingly restored, where we'd planned to retire someday, was now hosting my husband's affair. What neither of them knew was that the property deed amendment had finally arrived, and Robert was about to learn who truly owned the lakefront property he was so comfortably sharing with his mistress. Before we dive deeper into this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. If my story resonates with you, please hit subscribe. Tomorrow I'll be sharing some crucial legal advice every married person needs to hear before purchasing property together. I hadn't planned to visit our vacation home in Lake Harmony this weekend. For the past 2 months, I'd been in Seattle helping my sister through a high-risk pregnancy and complicated delivery. My nephew had finally arrived, tiny but healthy. And with my sister now on the mend, I decided to surprise Robert with an early return. After 8 weeks of hospital waiting rooms, sleepless nights on a pullout couch, and the constant worry over my sister and her baby, I craved the peace of our lakeside retreat. Robert had been distant during my absence. His calls grew shorter, less frequent. "Work is crazy," he'd explain. "The Henderson project is consuming everything." After 15 years of marriage to an architect whose career always seemed to intensify conveniently when family obligations arose, I'd accepted his excuses without question. That's what supporting spouses did, right? Make allowances. Understand. Pressures. Step back when careers demanded stepping up. Or at least, that's what I'd always told myself. When I called him yesterday to share my travel plans, he'd sounded startled, almost panicked. "You're coming home? Tomorrow?" I thought. Isn't Melissa still needing help with the baby? "She's doing much better," I'd explained, "and her mother-in-law arrived yesterday. I thought you'd be happy I'm coming home early." Of course," he'd recovered quickly. "It's just, I'm heading up to the lake house tonight. The Henderson clients want to see some comparable properties in that area. I'll be there all weekend." It had seemed like perfect timing. "Even better, I'll fly directly to Harrisburg and meet you there. I could use some lake air after all this time in the hospital." His hesitation had been palpable. "That's not... I'll be working, Catherine. Site visits, meetings. It won't be relaxing for you." Something in his voice, a note of desperation I'd never heard before, had triggered a forgotten instinct. After hanging up, I'd called his office and learned the Henderson project had been completed 3 weeks ago. The clients had already moved in. So here I was, pulling into the gravel driveway of our vacation home, watching a strange woman in my kitchen pouring wine into my hand-painted anniversary glasses. Robert stood behind her, arms encircling her waist, lips pressed against her neck in a display of intimacy we hadn't shared in years. The property deed amendment in the envelope beside me wasn't something I'd planned or anticipated needing. It had been my father's idea 6 months ago, when he'd decided to distribute part of his estate early to avoid inheritance complications. "Put the lake property solely in your name," he'd advised during a private conversation at his 75th birthday celebration. I've seen too many marriages destroyed by financial entanglements when things go south. I'd protested then. "Dad, Robert and I are fine. We've been married 15 years. My father, a retired judge who'd presided over more divorce cases than he could count, had fixed me with the steady gaze that had made witnesses squirm for decades. Healthy marriages aren't damaged by smart financial decisions, Catherine. Unhealthy ones are revealed by them. To humor him, I'd agreed to his gift. He would buy out Robert's half of the lake house, transferring full ownership to me. Robert hadn't objected. In fact, he'd seemed relieved to have the extra capital to invest in his firm's expansion. The paperwork had taken months, delayed by my father's meticulous attention to legal details, and then by my sudden departure to help Melissa. And now the timing seemed almost orchestrated by the universe. The final amendment delivered to my Seattle address and forwarded here just as Robert decided our vacation home was the perfect love nest for his affair. I stepped out of the rental car, the gravel crunching beneath my shoes, sounding unnaturally loud in the peaceful lakeside setting. Birds called from the surrounding pines, and somewhere in the distance, a motorboat growled across the water. It was early October, and the maple trees lining the property had begun their spectacular transformation, their leaves burning crimson and gold in the afternoon light. This place had always represented peace to me. Now it felt like a battlefield I never wanted to enter. My key still worked, small mercies, and I pushed open the heavy wooden door that Robert and I had salvaged from an old barn and refinished together during our first summer here. The sound of laughter cut off abruptly. Whispers, a glass clinking against a countertop. "Is someone there?" Robert's voice called out, tension evident in every syllable. I stepped into the great room, my heels clicking against the reclaimed oak floors we'd installed together 5 years ago. Through the archway to the kitchen, I could see them both frozen in place. Robert still in his office clothes, tie loosened, and a tall woman with striking red hair, wearing what appeared to be nothing but one of my husband's dress shirts. "Catherine?" Robert breathed, his face draining of color. You're here." "Evidently," I replied, my voice surprisingly steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. The redhead's eyes widened. She clutched the shirt closer around her thighs. "You must be the sister," she said, confidence wavering as she took in my expression. "The sister?" I repeated, looking at Robert with a raised eyebrow. He stepped forward, hands raised in a placating gesture. "Catherine, I can explain." "I'm sure you can," I interrupted, placing my purse and the manila envelope on the reclaimed wood console table we'd found at an antique market in Vermont. "You've always been excellent at explanations." The woman looked between us, confusion replacing her initial embarrassment. "You told me she was your sister," she said to Robert, accusation creeping into her tone. "That she lived in Seattle and rarely visited." I laughed then, a sharp, brittle sound that surprised even me. "Well, he got 2 facts right at least. I do have a sister in Seattle, and I haven't visited here in 8 weeks. But that's because I've been helping my actual sister with a difficult childbirth. And I haven't visited my vacation home, my home, because I was trusting my husband to respect our marriage while I was gone." Robert's face had morphed from shock to calculation, an expression I recognized from our rare arguments when he was formulating a defense strategy. "This isn't what it looks like, Catherine." "Really?" I gestured toward the woman who was now backing slowly toward the hallway that led to our bedroom. "Because it looks exactly like you moved your girlfriend into our vacation home while I was across the country caring for my sister and new nephew." The redhead grabbed a small purse from the kitchen counter. "I should go," she murmured. "You don't have to leave, Vanessa," Robert said quickly. "This is my house too. We can sort this out like adults." Vanessa. She had a name. Of course she did. She wasn't just some abstract concept of infidelity. She was a real person, with a life that had somehow become entangled with mine without my knowledge or consent. Actually, I said, reaching for the manila envelope, that's something we should discuss. I pulled out the property deed amendment and held it up so both of them could see the official seal. As of last week, this isn't your house anymore, Robert. My father's gift to me is complete. He bought out your half. I am now the sole owner of this property. Robert stared at the document, disbelief etched across his features. That's not possible. The paperwork wasn't finalized. It was delayed. I corrected him. But very much finalized. You signed the initial agreement 6 months ago. The money was deposited into your business account last month. Did you think my father would leave a legal transaction incomplete? Vanessa had frozen halfway to the hallway, her gaze darting between us like she was watching a tennis match with increasingly high stakes. You can't just show up and claim the house, Robert said, his voice hardening as he recovered from the initial shock. I'm not claiming anything, I replied. I'm stating a legal fact. This property belongs solely to me now, and I'd like both of you to leave. Robert's expression darkened. He drew himself up to his full height. The imposing stance he used in client presentations and partnership negotiations. This is ridiculous. We need to talk about this privately. He shot a meaningful look at Vanessa. I agree, I said, surprising him. Vanessa, was it? I apologize that you've been drawn into this situation. It seems my husband hasn't been honest with either of us. I'd appreciate some privacy to discuss this with him. Vanessa nodded quickly, relief washing over her face. I'll just get my things, she said, disappearing down the hallway to our bedroom. When we were alone, Robert immediately shifted tactics. The intimidating posture melted into something more conciliatory. Catherine, you have every right to be upset. This situation. It just happened. I wasn't looking for anything outside our marriage. They never are, I thought, remembering my father's cynical commentary on the divorce cases he'd presided over. And yet somehow it managed to just happen in our vacation home while I was thousands of miles away caring for my sister. I know how this looks, he began. Do you? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been living a double life. How long has this been going on, Robert? He hesitated just long enough for me to know the answer would hurt. It's complicated. Apparently not complicated enough to prevent you from moving her into our home, I noted, maintaining an outward calm I certainly didn't feel. Does she have a drawer in the bedroom yet? A side of the closet? Or did you just clear all my things out for convenience? Anger flashed across his face. You're never here anymore, Catherine. You're always busy with your family, your causes, your projects. What did you expect? The audacity of his accusation momentarily stunned me. I expected basic decency, I finally managed. I expected the vows we made to mean something. I expected my husband not to blame me for his infidelity because I was helping my sister through a life-threatening pregnancy. He looked away, unable to meet my gaze. Vanessa reappeared with an overnight bag slung over her shoulder, now dressed, in jeans and a sweater. Her face was flushed with embarrassment or anger, possibly both. I'll wait in the car, she told Robert, not looking at me as she hurried past. After the front door closed behind her, Robert and I stood in silence, the magnitude of what had happened expanding to fill every corner of the room. This kitchen where we'd cooked holiday meals for friends, the living room where we'd planned to host future grandchildren someday, all of it contaminated now by betrayal. "How long?" I asked again. Robert sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. 6 months, he admitted. "She's a client. It just developed. 6 months. Half a year of lies, which meant it had started well before my sister's pregnancy complications, before I'd left to help her. The realization made my knees weak, and I sank onto one of the bar stools at the kitchen counter. "I want a divorce," Robert said abruptly, the words hanging in the air between us like a physical thing. I stared at him, this stranger wearing my husband's face. "You've been planning this," I realized aloud. "You were waiting for the right moment to tell me." He had the grace to look somewhat ashamed. "I was going to tell you when you got back. From Seattle. I didn't want to add to your stress while your sister was in the hospital." "How considerate," I said, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. "Vanessa and I— It's serious, Catherine. We're talking about building a life together." Each word felt like another small betrayal piled atop the larger one. Not only had he cheated, but he'd developed feelings, made plans, envisioned a future, all while I believed we were still partners working toward our shared goals. "In my house?" I asked, gesturing around the lake home we'd spent years perfecting. "That's not fair," he protested. "I didn't know about the property transfer. As far as I knew, this was still half mine." "And that makes it acceptable to move. Your girlfriend in? To lie about where you were and what you were doing?" I shook my head, a strange calm settling over me. "Take your things and leave, Robert. We can discuss divorce proceedings through attorneys." He looked like he wanted to argue further, but something in my expression must have told him it would be futile. "I'll need to come back for the rest of my belongings," he said stiffly. "We can arrange a time," I replied, "when I'm not here." He nodded, then hesitated. "For what it's worth, I am sorry for how this happened. I never meant to hurt you." The platitude, so inadequate, so hollow, nearly broke my carefully maintained composure, but I simply nodded, not trusting myself to speak. After Robert left, I stood in the silent house, listening to the unfamiliar sound of my marriage ending. Car doors slamming, engines starting, gravel crunching as they drove away. Only when their taillights had disappeared down the winding road did I allow the tears to come. I cried for the 15 years I'd invested in a relationship that my husband had discarded so easily. I cried for the future we'd planned that would never materialize. I cried for my own blindness, for the warning signs I must have missed or ignored. When the storm of emotion finally passed, I wiped my face and moved through the house methodically, opening windows to clear the lingering scent of unfamiliar perfume. I stripped the bed linens and stuffed them into the washing machine, scrubbed the bathroom until it gleamed, and poured out the wine they'd been drinking. By midnight, I had reclaimed the physical space, but the emotional terrain still felt foreign and treacherous. I sat on the deck overlooking the moonlit lake, wrapped in a blanket against the October chill, and tried to imagine a future different from the one I'd been planning for 15 years. My phone buzzed with a text from my sister. "Made it home. From hospital today. How's the surprise homecoming with Robert?" I stared at her innocent question, unsure how to respond. Finally, I typed, "Not what I expected. We'll call tomorrow with updates." As I set the phone down, I noticed another message had arrived while I was cleaning. This one from my father. "Amendment delivered? Call me when you've reviewed it." My father, with his cynical view of marriage born from decades of witnessing divorces at their worst. My father, whose insistence on putting the lake house solely in my name had just provided me with solid ground in the earthquake of my collapsing marriage. My father, who somehow had seen something I'd been blind to. I would call him tomorrow, thank him for his foresight, and begin planning my next steps. But tonight, I needed to sit with the reality of my situation, to acknowledge the pain without drowning in it. The lake stretched before me, its surface rippling gently in the breeze. It had witnessed the rise and fall of my marriage, and it would witness whatever came next. In this moment of clarity between the life I'd thought I had and whatever lay ahead, I made a promise to myself. I would not let Robert's betrayal define me or diminish my capacity for joy. I would rebuild, starting with this house that was now undeniably mine. I thought about how I had spent years compromising, adjusting my dreams to fit within the container of our marriage. Perhaps this devastating end was also a beginning, a chance to rediscover who Catherine Harlow was without the title of Robert's wife attached to her identity. The thought didn't erase the pain of betrayal, but it offered something I desperately needed: possibility. And for tonight, that would have to be enough. Morning arrived with harsh clarity, sunlight streaming through the windows I'd forgotten to close the night before. For a blissful few seconds between sleep and wakefulness, I existed in the comfortable limbo of not remembering. Then reality crashed back, and the weight of Robert's betrayal settled over me like a physical presence. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, a text from my sister followed by one from my father. I ignored both for the moment, needing to gather my strength before explaining the situation to anyone. Instead, I made coffee and carried it out to the deck, watching mist rise off the lake in delicate tendrils that dissolved in the morning light. I had always loved this view. When Robert and I first discovered this property 7 years ago, it had been the panoramic vista of water and mountains that sold us both. The house itself had been a disaster, a 1970s structure with shag carpeting and wood paneling that had seen better days. We'd spent every vacation and long weekend for 2 years renovating it, transforming it room by room into our perfect retreat. Now I wondered if Robert had brought Vanessa here because of convenience, or because he wanted to rewrite our history in this place. The thought of them enjoying coffee on this same deck, admiring this same view, made my stomach clench. The sound of tires on gravel pulled me from my thoughts. A silver SUV I didn't recognize was pulling into the driveway. For a moment, I tensed. Was Robert returning already? But then a familiar figure emerged, and I felt my shoulders relax. Elena Martinez, my closest friend in Lake Harmony, waved as she spotted me on the deck. We had met 5 years ago at a community fundraiser for the local library, bonding over our shared love of mystery novels and our mutual frustration with small-town politics. She owned a bakery in town and lived year-round at the lake, keeping an eye on seasonal properties like ours when owners were away. "I saw lights on last night and thought I'd better check," she called as she climbed the steps to the deck, carrying a bakery box that undoubtedly contained her famous cinnamon rolls. "Your text said you weren't coming until next week," I managed. A weak smile. Change of plans. Elena's warm brown eyes narrowed as she took in my appearance. Yesterday's clothes, uncombed hair, the unmistakable puffiness of eyes that had spent hours crying. "What happened?" she asked, setting the box on the table and taking the chair beside me. I hadn't planned to tell anyone yet, but Elena's direct question broke something loose inside me. The words spilled out. Robert's affair, his girlfriend in our house, the property deed that had given me unexpected leverage, all of it tumbling forth in a rush that left me breathless. Elena listened without interrupting, her expression shifting, from shock to outrage to fierce protectiveness. When I finished, she reached over and gripped my hand. "That absolute bastard," she said with quiet intensity. "In your house, while you were helping Melissa." I nodded, grateful for her validation. "Have you called a lawyer?" she asked. "Not yet. It just happened yesterday. I'm still trying to process everything." Elena leaned forward. "Listen to me, Catherine. I watched my sister go through almost exactly this 3 years ago. The most important thing right now is to protect yourself, legally, financially, emotionally. Men like Robert, they don't just have affairs. They calculate. They plan exit strategies." I thought about Robert's quick pivot to wanting a divorce. How prepared he'd seemed with that announcement despite being caught completely off guard by my arrival. "You think he's been planning this? 6 months with the girlfriend? Absolutely. He's been planning. And you need to get ahead of it." She pulled out her phone. "Morgan Chen, best divorce attorney within 100 miles. Took my sister's ex to the cleaners when he tried hiding assets during their divorce." I stared at the contact information on her screen. The idea of actually calling a divorce attorney made this all so real, so final. "I don't know if I'm ready for that step yet." Elena's expression softened. "I know it feels overwhelming, but at least have a consultation. Knowledge is power, Catherine. And from what you've told me, Robert has been operating with a lot more information than you have for quite some time." That landed with unexpected force. Robert had indeed been living in a reality I knew nothing about, making decisions that affected both our lives without my knowledge or consent. Whatever came next, I needed to enter it with my eyes fully open. "Okay," I agreed quietly. "I'll call." After Elena left, extracting a promise that I would join her for dinner that evening, I finally called my father. His response to my news was typically restrained. No outbursts of anger or offers to confront Robert, just a methodical series of questions about what had happened and what I planned to do next. "I'll have Morgan Chen contact you," he said, after I mentioned Elena's recommendation. "I know her reputation. She's excellent." "Dad, how did you know?" I asked, the question that had been burning inside me since last night. "About Robert, about the house. How did you see this coming when I didn't?" There was a long pause. "I didn't know specifically," he finally said. "But I've seen enough marriages dissolve to recognize certain patterns. Robert's focus on his career at the expense of your relationship. The separate vacations that became more frequent. The way he spoke about your work as if it were a hobby rather than a career. Each observation hit like a small hammer, breaking apart my illusions about my marriage. These were all things I had noticed but rationalized away, telling myself that all long-term relationships went through phases, that Robert's dismissive attitude toward my career as a landscape designer was just his way of teasing. "I should have seen it," I said, more to myself than to my father. "Don't do that to yourself," he replied firmly. "Robert made choices, Catherine. Deliberate choices to betray your trust and violate your marriage. That's on him, not you." After hanging up, I did something I'd been avoiding. I logged into our joint bank accounts. What I found confirmed Elena's suspicions that Robert had been planning his exit. The balance in our shared savings account, which had contained nearly $40,000 the last time I checked, was now just under $5,000. A series of withdrawals over the past 3 months had systematically drained it. The checking account showed a similar pattern, regular transfers to an account I didn't recognize, each labeled simply investment opportunity. The property taxes for the lake house, which should have been paid from this account last month, showed as overdue. The discovery sent a wave of cold fury through me, displacing some of the grief that had dominated since yesterday. This wasn't just a matter of the heart anymore. Robert had been deliberately undermining our financial security while I was focused on helping my sister. By the time Morgan Chen's office called to schedule a consultation for that afternoon, I was more than ready. The initial shock had crystallized into something harder, more focused. Robert had broken our marriage vows, our trust, and apparently our financial agreements as well. Whatever sentimentality I might have felt about our 15 years together was rapidly being eclipsed by the need to protect myself from further damage. Morgan Chen's office was in downtown Harrisburg, an hour's drive from Lake Harmony. I used the time to call my sister Melissa, finally sharing what had happened. Her reaction was exactly what I needed, equal parts outrage on my behalf and practical advice about moving forward. "You're staying at the lake house, right?" she asked. "Not going back to the Philadelphia house?" I hadn't even thought about our primary residence yet. The stylish townhouse in Philadelphia's Society Hill neighborhood that we'd purchased 10 years ago, where most of my belongings still resided. "I don't know," I admitted. "I haven't planned that far ahead." "Well, you should consider it," Melissa said. "Dad mentioned the Philadelphia property is jointly owned. If the lake house is solely yours, it might be smarter to base yourself there during the divorce." "I hadn't thought about it strategically," I said, slightly uncomfortable with the calculating tone our conversation had taken. "Well, someone needs to," my sister replied bluntly, "because I guarantee Robert is thinking about every angle. Men like him always do." Morgan Chen's office occupied the top floor of a restored Victorian building. The woman herself was a study in contained energy, petite, impeccably dressed, with a directness that was both intimidating and reassuring. "Your father called me this morning," she said after we were seated in her office. "He filled me in on the basics, but I'd like to hear the situation in your own words." I recounted the events of the past 24 hours, then expanded to include what I'd discovered about our finances. Morgan took notes on a sleek tablet, occasionally asking clarifying questions but mostly letting me talk. "The lake house is completely in your name?" she confirmed when I finished. I nodded, pulling out the property deed amendment from my bag. "As of last week, my father bought out Robert's half as a gift to me." She examined the document, nodding with satisfaction. "This is excellent. Clean, properly executed. And the timing, while unfortunate emotionally, is actually quite advantageous." "Legally? What do you mean?" "Your husband can't claim he didn't agree to the transfer. His signature is here, dated 6 months ago. He accepted payment for his portion. The fact that he then moved his girlfriend into a property he no longer had any legal claim to actually strengthens our position considerably." She set the deed aside and leaned forward. "Now, about the financial irregularities you discovered. When did these withdrawals begin?" 3 months ago, from what I can tell. But I haven't had time to do a thorough investigation yet." Morgan made another note. "We'll want a complete forensic accounting of all marital finances. If Robert has been systematically moving assets in preparation for divorce, that's what we call dissipation of marital assets. The courts take a very dim view of such actions." For the next hour, we discussed strategy, immediate steps to protect my interests, documentation I needed to gather, and the overall approach to the divorce proceedings. Morgan was methodical and thorough, outlining a plan that made me feel for the first time since discovering Robert's betrayal, that I might emerge from this disaster with my dignity and financial security intact. "What about the Philadelphia house?" I asked, remembering Melissa's question. "Jointly owned properties are typically divided equally in divorce," Morgan explained. "However, given what we now know about Robert's financial behavior, it might be possible to negotiate keeping the house in exchange for other concessions. It depends on what you want, Catherine." What did I want? The question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on responding to Robert's actions that I hadn't considered what I actually desired for my post-divorce life. "I need time to think about that," I admitted. Morgan nodded. "That's completely understandable. For now, let's focus on the immediate steps: securing your finances, documenting the state of your marital assets, and filing the initial divorce petition. We can refine the long-term strategy as we go." By the time I left Morgan's office, I had a clear action plan and a sense of purpose that had been missing since the moment I saw Vanessa in my kitchen. The drive back to Lake Harmony gave me time to reflect on what I'd learned, both about Robert's actions and about my options moving forward. I decided to stop in town before returning to the lake house. Elena's bakery, Sweet Crumb, occupied a charming storefront on Main Street. The afternoon rush had ended, and I found her behind the counter, boxing up the day's remaining pastries. "Perfect timing," she called when she saw me. "I was just closing up. Dinner at my place in an hour?" I nodded, sinking into one of the cafe chairs as she finished her closing routine. "I met with Morgan Chen." "And? What did you think?" "She's formidable," I said, a small smile tugging at my lips. "In the best possible way." Elena grinned. "Told you, she doesn't mess around." She flipped the sign on the door to closed and joined me at the table. "So what's the plan?" I outlined what Morgan had advised: freezing joint credit cards, documenting all marital assets, changing passwords on my personal accounts, and preparing for the likelihood that Robert would not make this process easy. "What about emotionally?" Elena asked. "All the legal stuff is necessary, but you're also dealing with a massive betrayal. Have you thought about talking to someone?" I shook my head. I haven't had time to think beyond the immediate crisis. "Well, Dr. Sarah Collins in town is excellent. She helped me work through my divorce 5 years ago." I looked up in surprise. Elena had never mentioned being divorced. In all our conversations over the years, she'd simply said she wasn't married, and I hadn't pressed for details. Seeing my expression, she shrugged. "It's not something I talk about much anymore. 10 years, no kids, ended when I found out he'd been living a double life with a woman in Pittsburgh for 3 of those years. Elena, I had no idea." "It's ancient history now," she said, waving a hand dismissively. "But at the time, it nearly destroyed me. Not just the betrayal, but the way it made me question my own judgment, my own perceptions of reality. That's why I'm suggesting Sarah. This isn't just about legalities, Catherine. It's about rebuilding your sense of self after someone has taken a wrecking ball to it." Her words resonated deeply. Beyond the anger and pain, there was a profound sense of disorientation, as if the map of my life had suddenly been revealed as fiction, leaving me without bearings in unfamiliar territory. "I'll think about it," I promised. Dinner at Elena's lakeside cottage was exactly what I needed: simple comfort food, a glass of good wine, and conversation that occasionally veered away from my marital disaster to books, local gossip, and plans for the upcoming winter. "You should stay through the holidays," Elena suggested as we sat on her screened porch, watching fireflies blink in the gathering darkness. The lake is magical in winter, and it might be good to create some new traditions for yourself. The idea held unexpected appeal. I'd always returned to Philadelphia for the winter months, but the thought of staying here, experiencing the quiet beauty of the frozen lake and snow-covered mountains, felt like a gift I could give myself. "Maybe I will," I said. "Though I'll need to go back to Philadelphia soon to deal with the house and get my things." Elena nodded. "When you do, I'm coming with you. No arguments," she added when I started to protest. "You shouldn't have to face that alone." Her offer brought unexpected tears to my eyes. "Thank you. That's what friends are for," she said simply. "To show up when life falls apart." When I returned to the lake house that night, the emptiness felt less threatening than it had the previous evening. I moved through the rooms, turning on lamps, creating pools of warm light against the darkness. This was my home now, solely mine in a way it had never been before. I could change anything I wanted, redecorate without compromise, make this space truly my own. The thought was both liberating and intimidating. For 15 years, I had defined myself largely in relation to Robert, his wife, his supporter, his partner. Who was I without those reference points? What did Catherine Harlow, not Catherine Mercer, want for her life? As I prepared for bed, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "We need to talk. This isn't over. R." Robert, using a phone I didn't recognize. My first instinct was to respond immediately, to demand explanations about the drained bank accounts, to express the hurt and anger that still churned inside me. Instead, I remembered Morgan's advice. Communication through attorneys only. Anything you say directly to him can be used against you later. I set the phone aside without replying. Whatever Robert wanted to discuss could wait until the legal boundaries of our separation were established. For tonight, I needed rest more than I needed answers. As I drifted toward sleep, I found myself thinking about something my mother had told me years ago before cancer took her when I was just 24. "The most important relationship you'll ever have is with yourself, Catherine. Nurture it as carefully as you would nurture a garden. Everything else grows from that foundation." At the time, I'd thought I understood her wisdom. Now, facing the prospect of rebuilding my life from the ground up, her words took on new meaning. The garden of my marriage had been revealed as largely illusion, beautiful on the surface but rotting at the roots. Whatever I grew next would need more honest tending, starting with a clearer understanding of my own needs and boundaries. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, practical matters of finances and legalities, emotional terrain I had yet to fully navigate. But tonight, in this house that was now unquestionably mine, I made a silent promise to the mother I still missed every day. I would tend my own garden first, nurturing my sense of self with the same care and attention I had once poured into a marriage that hadn't deserved it. It was, I realized, the first step toward whatever came next. Not just surviving Robert's betrayal, but eventually thriving despite it. The path ahead was unclear, but for the first time since discovering Vanessa in my kitchen, I felt a flicker of something that might, with careful nurturing, grow into hope. The next 3 days passed in a whirlwind of activity that left little time for dwelling on emotional wounds. Following Morgan's guidance, I systematically secured my financial situation, opening new accounts at a different bank, transferring my personal funds, documenting the state of our joint accounts, and gathering every financial record I could access. Each completed task felt like laying another brick in the foundation of my new life. Robert continued texting from the unknown number, his messages growing increasingly frustrated by my silence. "We need to talk about the house," followed by, "You can't just ignore me, Catherine," and finally, "My attorney will be contacting you." I forwarded each message to Morgan without responding, a small act of self-discipline that grew easier with practice. On the third day, as promised, Morgan received a call from Robert's attorney, Lawrence Whitfield, a high-powered divorce lawyer from one of Philadelphia's most prestigious firms. "He's going for intimidation right out of the gate," Morgan told me during our evening check-in call. Whitfield specializes in representing wealthy professionals and has a reputation for aggressive tactics. "Should I be worried?" I asked, gazing out at the lake from my deck, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of amber and gold. "Not at all," Morgan replied, and I could hear the smile in her voice. In fact, this tells us something valuable about Robert's strategy. He's willing to spend considerable money on legal representation, which suggests he believes he has significant assets to protect. Or that he's trying to scare me into a quick, unfavorable settlement, I suggested. Precisely. Which is why we're going to take our time and be thoroughly prepared before engaging in any negotiations. The next step in that preparation arrived the following morning. Samantha Rhodes, the forensic accountant Morgan had recommended. Samantha was a former IRS investigator who now specialized in uncovering financial misconduct in divorce cases. With her no-nonsense demeanor and meticulous attention to detail, she reminded me of my father. "Financial deception usually follows predictable patterns," she explained as we sat at my dining table, spreading out the bank statements and tax returns I'd gathered. "Most people aren't nearly as clever as they think they are when hiding money." For the next several hours, Samantha methodically tracked the flow of funds through our various accounts, noting patterns and anomalies, asking pointed questions about Robert's business dealings and our financial habits as a couple. "There's definitely something happening here," she said finally, indicating a series of transfers to an account I didn't recognize. "These regular movements, $5,000 every 2 weeks for the past 4 months, that's a classic dissipation pattern. Not large enough to immediately raise alarms, but consistent enough to move significant assets over time." "Where is the money going?" I asked. "That's what we need to find out," Samantha replied, making another note. "I'll need to subpoena records from this bank. Also, have you checked your credit report recently?" I shook my head. "Not in at least a year." "Let's do that now," she suggested. Sometimes spouses open credit accounts in both names without the other's knowledge. The credit check revealed exactly what Samantha had suspected. 2 new credit cards opened 6 months ago, both carrying balances close to their $15,000 limits. I had never seen the cards, never received statements, never authorized the accounts. "Identity theft," Samantha said matter-of-factly. "Except in this case, as your spouse, Robert had enough personal information to open joint accounts without triggering fraud alerts." The discovery left me breathless with anger and disbelief. "He's put us $30,000 in debt without my knowledge? How is that even legal?" "It's not," Samantha assured me. "We'll dispute these accounts immediately." But this further confirms that Robert has been systematically preparing for divorce for some time, creating financial entanglements that he likely hoped would pressure you into a quick settlement. By the end of Samantha's visit, we had identified nearly $140,000 in assets that Robert had diverted from our joint accounts over the past 6 months, a substantial sum that represented years of our combined savings. The revelation was both infuriating and oddly liberating. Each new discovery about Robert's deception made it easier to let go of any lingering attachment to the marriage I thought I had. That evening, as Elena and I shared dinner on my deck, I found myself able to talk about the situation with more clarity and less raw emotion than I had just days ago. "It's like I'm investigating a stranger," I told her, twirling pasta on my fork. "Each new thing I learn makes me wonder if I ever really knew him at all." Elena nodded thoughtfully. "After my divorce, I went through a phase of questioning every memory, trying to figure out which parts of our relationship had been real and which had been performance. It was exhausting." "How did you move past it?" "I stopped looking backward," she said simply. "At some point, I realized I was giving him power over my present by constantly trying to reinterpret my past. So I decided to focus on building something new instead." Her words resonated deeply. I had spent the past 4 days immersed in the deconstruction of my marriage. Necessary work, but inherently backward-looking. Perhaps it was time to balance that with some forward movement. "I've been thinking about expanding my landscape design business," I said, the idea taking shape, even as I voiced it. "I've always kept it part-time, fitting client projects around Robert's schedule and priorities. But I've had several potential clients here at the lake who've asked about more extensive projects." Elena's face lit up. "That's perfect. Your garden here is already the envy of half the lake residents. I bet you'd have more clients than you could handle if you decided to take it on full-time." The prospect was both exciting and intimidating. I had studied landscape architecture in college, but when Robert and I married, my career had gradually taken a back seat to his. My design work had become a hobby business, as Robert often called it, though it had steadily generated income over the years. I'd need to create a formal business plan, I mused. Set up a proper office space, maybe hire an assistant eventually. "You could use the sunroom," Elena suggested, gesturing toward the glass-enclosed space at the side of the house that currently served as little more than storage. "It has that amazing light and views of the garden. Perfect for a design studio." As we continued talking, the idea gained momentum. By the time Elena left that evening, I had filled several pages of a notebook with thoughts about transforming my part-time design work into a full-fledged business. Potential clients, marketing strategies, portfolio development, even a name: Lakeview Landscapes. The next morning, energized by having a forward-looking project to focus on, I began clearing out the sunroom. The space had become a dumping ground for outdoor furniture cushions, garden tools, and boxes of holiday decorations. As I sorted through the accumulated items, deciding what to keep and what to donate, I discovered a box I didn't immediately recognize. Inside were architectural plans, the original designs for our lake house renovation, drawings Robert and I had worked on together during those early years of owning the property. Beneath those were older sketches, my preliminary landscape designs, for the property, many of which we had implemented over the years. Looking at those drawings, I was struck by the passion and detail evident in my work. The careful consideration of sightlines from different windows, the thoughtful plant selections that provided year-round interest, the outdoor living spaces, designed to maximize both sun and shade at different times of day, all reflected a level of expertise and creativity I had somehow discounted over the years. Had that been Robert's influence? His tendency to refer to my design work as a nice little business or a creative outlet, rather than a legitimate career? Or had I diminished my own talents, internalizing the idea that my work was secondary to his? The questions were uncomfortable but necessary. If I was going to rebuild my life on a stronger foundation, I needed to understand not just how Robert had deceived me, but how I had perhaps deceived myself, allowing my dreams and ambitions to be contained within the boundaries of his comfort. I set the box aside, making a mental note to review those designs again when building my portfolio, and continued clearing the space. By afternoon, the sunroom had been transformed, the unnecessary items removed, the windows cleaned to allow maximum light, the tile floor swept and mopped. I stood in the center, envisioning how it would look as a proper design studio with a buoy, drafting table, comfortable consultation seating, and displays of my work. For the first time since discovering Robert's betrayal, I felt a genuine surge of excitement about the future. Not just determination to protect myself in the divorce, but anticipation for what I might create in the aftermath. That feeling carried me through the next major hurdle, the formal filing of divorce papers. Morgan had prepared everything, and the process of reviewing and signing the documents was surprisingly anticlimactic. The legal language reduced 15 years of marriage to a series of clinical statements about irreconcilable differences and equitable distribution of assets. "What happens next?" I asked Morgan after signing the last page. "Robert will be officially served these papers within the next few days," she explained. "Once that happens, the temporary restraining order goes into effect, preventing either of you from selling or transferring marital assets without court approval. Then we wait for his response." "And if he contests it?" "He likely will," Morgan said with a pragmatic shrug. "Most high-conflict divorces involve at least some contested elements. But given what we've documented about his financial misconduct and infidelity, his position isn't particularly strong. This is more about strategy than actual legal advantage." I nodded, trying to prepare myself for what would likely be months of legal back and forth. "I'm going to Philadelphia next week," I told her. "I need to collect personal items from the house and get a sense of what state it's in." "That's a good idea," Morgan agreed. "But take someone with you and document everything. If Robert has been living there with Vanessa, you may find the property has been altered or that some of your belongings are missing." Elena, true to her word, insisted on accompanying me to Philadelphia. We made the 3-hour drive on a Tuesday morning, planning to stay overnight and return the following day. As we approached the familiar streets of Society Hill, I felt a strange detachment, as if I were visiting a place I had once lived long ago, rather than the home I had shared with Robert until just 3 months earlier. The townhouse looked the same from the exterior, its federal-style brick facade meticulously maintained, the window boxes I had planted in spring still showing the remains of summer flowers. But when I unlocked the door and stepped inside, it was immediately clear that the interior had changed significantly. The entryway, once decorated with a careful blend of antique and contemporary pieces we had collected over the years, now featured sleeker, more modern furnishings. The warm cream walls had been repainted a stark white. Family photos that had once lined the staircase, pictures of our travels, our holidays with extended family, our life together, had been removed, replaced with abstract art I didn't recognize. "Well," Elena said beside me, her voice carefully neutral, "this is different." I moved through the first floor in a state of muted shock. The living room had been entirely redecorated, our comfortable, slightly worn leather sofa replaced with a minimalist sectional in charcoal gray. The bookshelves that had housed my collection of gardening books and classic novels were now filled with sleek art objects, and a handful of fashion-forward coffee table books. "It looks like a furniture showroom," Elena observed, running a finger along the edge of a glass side table that had replaced the antique chest I'd inherited from my grandmother. The kitchen had undergone the most dramatic transformation. The warm cherry cabinets I had selected 10 years ago had been replaced with high-gloss white ones. The butcher block island where I had prepared countless meals was gone, swapped for a waterfall-edge marble monstrosity that dominated the space. "He renovated the entire kitchen," I said, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. "In 3 months." Elena squeezed my arm. "Are you okay?" I took a deep breath, taking another look around the space that had been so thoroughly transformed. The shock was wearing off, replaced by something unexpected, a sense of clarity. This kitchen, like the rest of the house, no longer contained any trace of me or the life I had built here. Robert had erased my presence as thoroughly as if I had never existed. "I'm okay," I said, surprised to find it was true. "Actually, I'm better than okay. This makes things simpler." Elena raised an eyebrow. "How so?" "I've been torn about what to do with this house, whether to fight for it in the divorce or let it go. But this isn't my home anymore. Robert and Vanessa have already claimed it, changed it to suit themselves. I don't want to reclaim something that's been so thoroughly altered." The realization was liberating. Whatever attachment I had felt to this house, the memories it contained, the life I had built within its walls, had been severed by Robert's systematic erasure. The property was now just an asset to be divided, not an emotional anchor I needed to preserve. We continued our tour of the house, documenting the changes with photographs as Morgan had suggested. The main bathroom had been gutted and modernized. The guest bedroom had become a home office with no sign of the antique desk that had been my mother's. Even our bedroom had been transformed. The 4-poster bed replaced with a platform model. The warm colors I had chosen swapped for a cold palette of grays and whites. Only when we reached my closet did I feel a flicker of genuine distress. The space had been emptied, with no sign of my clothes, shoes, or accessories. The built-in drawers that had held my jewelry, including pieces inherited from my mother and grandmother, stood open and vacant. "Where is all my stuff?" I whispered, a knot forming in my throat. Elena's expression hardened. "This crosses a line. He has no right to dispose of your personal property." We searched the rest of the house, eventually discovering a collection of hastily packed boxes in the basement storage area. My clothes had been carelessly stuffed inside, many items wrinkled or damaged in the process. A small jewelry box contained some of my everyday pieces, but the most valuable items, my mother's sapphire necklace, my grandmother's pearl earrings, the diamond bracelet Robert had given me for our 10th anniversary, were noticeably absent. "Document everything that's missing," Elena advised, her voice tight with controlled anger. "We're taking these photos straight to Morgan when we get back." We spent the rest of the day sorting through the boxes, salvaging what could be saved, and listing what appeared to be missing. By evening, we had filled Elena's SUV with the personal items I wanted to keep: photographs, books, small keepsakes, and the clothes that hadn't been ruined, and created detailed documentation of everything that was missing or damaged. "We could stay at a hotel," Elena suggested as we finished loading the car. "You look exhausted." I shook my head, looking up at the townhouse that had been my home for a decade. "No, I want to go back to the lake. I'm done here." As we drove away, I felt a weight lifting. the complicated grief of losing not just my marriage but the physical space that had contained so much of my adult life. Yet alongside that, grief was a growing sense of possibility. The house in Philadelphia, like my marriage to Robert, had been revealed as less solid, less permanent than I had believed. Both could be dismantled, rearranged, reimagined by someone else, and so could I. "You know what this means, don't you?" Elena said as we merged onto the highway heading west. "What?" "You're going to need new furniture for the lake house, a complete Catherine-centered redesign." I smiled at her deliberate lightness, grateful for her ability to find the positive angle in even difficult situations. "You're right. I've always compromised on decor to accommodate Robert's preferences. Maybe it's time the house reflected just my taste." "Exactly." Elena nodded emphatically. "Think of it as creating the physical manifestation of your new life. Every choice made solely by you, for you." The idea took root as we drove, growing into a vision of the lake house transformed, not in the cold showroom style Robert had imposed on our Philadelphia home, but in ways that reflected my authentic preferences. Warmer colors, natural materials, spaces designed for both comfort and beauty. A home that would nurture my creative spirit rather than contain it. By the time we reached Lake Harmony late that night, I had sketched a rough plan for renovating the master bedroom, the first space I wanted to reclaim fully as my own. Tomorrow I would contact local contractors about beginning the work. The project would give me something constructive to focus on while the legal process unfolded, a tangible way to build my new life even as my old one was being dismantled. As Elena helped me carry the last of my salvaged belongings into the house, she paused in the entryway, looking around thoughtfully. "You know," she said, "when I went through my divorce, a wise friend told me something that really helped. She said that some people come into our lives as permanent fixtures and others as renovation specialists. They tear down walls we didn't even know were limiting us, creating space for something better to be built." I considered her words, thinking about how Robert's betrayal had forced me to confront limitations I had accepted without question, in my career, my self-perception, my willingness to compromise fundamental aspects of myself for the sake of marital harmony. "I like that perspective," I said finally. "It doesn't erase the pain, but it gives it purpose." Elena smiled. "Exactly. Robert may have broken your marriage, but in doing so, he may have inadvertently freed you to build something far stronger and more authentic than what you had before." As I settled into bed that night, surrounded by the few treasured possessions I had reclaimed from my former home, I found myself thinking about the contrast between Robert's approach to remaking the Philadelphia house and my plans for the lake house. He had erased all traces of our shared history, creating a sterile showplace that reflected little genuine personality. I intended to honor the past while thoughtfully shaping a future, preserving what was valuable and beautiful from my history while making space for new growth. There was a metaphor in that contrast, one that illuminated the fundamental differences that had perhaps always existed between us, visible now only in retrospect. Robert approached life as a performance, a carefully curated display designed to impress others. I sought authenticity, connection to place and history, growth that built upon foundations rather than replacing them entirely. The Philadelphia house, with its complete transformation, had shown me something important. I didn't want to erase my past or pretend my marriage had never happened. Those 15 years had shaped me, taught me, brought both joy and pain that formed the person I now was. The challenge wasn't to remove all traces of that experience, but to integrate it wisely into whatever came next, taking the lessons without remaining bound by the limitations. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Call with Morgan about the missing jewelry, decisions about contractors for the bedroom renovation, continued work on my business plan. But tonight, in this house that was unquestionably mine, I felt the first stirrings of what might become a new kind of strength. One built not on the false security of a marriage that had been revealed as illusion, but on the growing certainty of my own resilience and capacity for renewal. 3 months after discovering Vanessa in my kitchen, I stood on the newly built dock extending into Lake Harmony, watching the first snowflakes of winter dance across the water's surface. The transformation of the landscape mirrored the changes in my own life, gradual at first, then suddenly dramatic and undeniable. "It's perfect," Elena said, joining me at the dock's edge. "Worth every penny of that settlement money." I smiled, taking in the sight of the dock we'd designed together, a substantial structure with a covered seating area at the end, positioned to capture both sunrise and sunset views. It had been my first major investment in the property since the divorce was finalized, a declaration that this place was now truly mine, designed for my pleasure alone. The legal battle with Robert had concluded more swiftly than Morgan had initially predicted, largely due to the overwhelming evidence of his financial misconduct. When faced with Samantha's forensic accounting report documenting the systematic diversion of marital assets, Robert's attorney had abruptly shifted from aggressive posturing to damage control. "He wants to settle," Morgan had informed me during a call 6 weeks after our visit to the Philadelphia house. "Apparently your documentation of the missing jewelry and the renovations he made without your knowledge or consent made quite an impression on Whitfield. He's concerned about how it would look to a judge." The settlement negotiations had been intense, but ultimately productive. I received the lake house, already legally mine, a fair portion of our investment accounts, and a substantial cash settlement that included compensation for the missing jewelry and damage to my personal property. Robert kept the Philadelphia townhouse, his retirement accounts, and his business interests, a clean division that allowed us both to move forward without prolonged legal entanglements. Did you ever imagine 3 months ago that you'd be standing here, officially divorced and genuinely happy about it? Elena asked, interrupting my reflections. I considered her question carefully. "No," I admitted. "When I first discovered Robert's betrayal, I could only see what I was losing. The future I thought we were building, the partnership I believed we had. I couldn't imagine finding joy on the other side of that devastation. And yet, here you are." Elena gestured toward the lake house behind us, where the newly installed floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the gray December sky. The house, like me, had undergone a significant transformation. The bedroom renovation I'd planned after our Philadelphia trip had expanded into a comprehensive remodeling of the entire main floor. Working with a local architect who specialized in maximizing views and natural light, I'd opened up walls, replaced smaller windows with expansive glass, and reorganized the flow of the space to better suit my needs and preferences. The sunroom had been transformed into a proper design studio, with custom shelving for material samples, a large drafting table positioned to capture northern light, and comfortable seating for client consultations. The formal dining room Robert had insisted upon, despite our rarely entertaining formally at the lake, had become a combination library and reading nook with built-in bookshelves and a window seat overlooking the water. Most significantly, I'd converted the guest bedroom into a small apartment with a separate entrance, creating income potential through vacation rentals during peak seasons. The renovation had been expensive but strategic, each change reflecting both my personal preferences and my new financial reality as a single woman building a business. "I'm proud of you, you know," Elena said, linking her arm through mine as we turned back toward the house. "Not just for surviving this, but for how you've handled every step of the process. You've been methodical but not vindictive, strategic but not bitter." Her words warmed me against the December chill. The path from betrayal to rebuilding hadn't been linear or simple. There had been dark days when grief overwhelmed me, moments of rage when I discovered yet another deception in Robert's financial dealings, nights when I questioned every decision I'd made during our 15 years together. Dr. Sarah Collins, the therapist Elena had recommended, had been instrumental in helping me navigate those emotional complexities. Our weekly sessions had created space to process the pain without becoming defined by it, to acknowledge the loss while focusing on reconstruction. The goal isn't to pretend the marriage never happened or that the betrayal didn't hurt, Sarah had explained during one particularly difficult session. It's to integrate those experiences into your understanding of yourself without allowing them to limit your vision of what's possible. That perspective had gradually shifted my focus from what Robert had taken from me to what I might create for myself. A perspective that had led directly to the most significant change in my post-divorce life. "Are you nervous about the meeting?" "Tomorrow?" Elena asked as we entered the house, stomping snow from our boots in the mudroom I'd added during the renovation. "A little," I admitted. Presenting my designs to the resort development team feels like a major step up from the residential projects I've been doing. Lakeview Landscapes, my hobby business, as Robert had dismissively called it, had evolved into a thriving enterprise over the past 3 months. What had begun as occasional design work for vacation homeowners around the lake had expanded to include several significant commercial projects, including the renovation of Elena's bakery and the landscaping for a new restaurant in town. Tomorrow's meeting with Mountain Vista Resorts represented a potential turning point, the opportunity to design the comprehensive landscape plan for a new eco-resort being developed on the western shore of the lake. It was the kind of large-scale, high-profile project I would never have pursued during my marriage, when Robert's subtle but persistent messaging about my work being just a creative outlet had constrained my professional ambitions. "You're going to impress them," Elena said confidently, following me into the kitchen where I began preparing tea. "Your preliminary designs are exactly what they're looking for. Environmentally sensitive but still luxurious." The kitchen, like the rest of the house, reflected my emergence from Robert's shadow. Gone was the sleek, minimalist aesthetic he had preferred, replaced with warm wood cabinets, soapstone countertops, and open shelving that displayed my collection of handmade pottery. It was a working kitchen designed for someone who actually enjoyed cooking rather than a showpiece meant to impress guests. "Even if I don't get the contract, the mere fact that I'm being considered feels like a victory," I said, pouring hot water into mugs. 6 months ago, I wouldn't have even submitted a proposal for a project this size. "Because Robert would have dismissed it as too ambitious?" Elena asked gently. I nodded, the truth of her observation settling with familiar weight. He never directly told me not to pursue larger projects, but he had a way of questioning whether I had the experience or capacity, suggesting it might be too much pressure given my other responsibilities. "Classic undermining disguised as concern," Elena observed. My ex was a master of that technique too. We carried our tea to the living room, settling into the comfortable seating area arranged to maximize the view of the lake. The interior designer I'd worked with had helped me create a space that balanced aesthetic beauty with genuine comfort. A room designed to be lived in, not just admired. "Have you heard from him recently?" Elena asked after a comfortable silence. "Not directly," I replied. "His attorney contacted Morgan last week about some tax documents they need for the sale of his firm, but that's been the extent of our communication since the settlement was finalized." The clean break had been my choice, a decision supported by both Morgan and Sarah. With no children to co-parent and no remaining financial entanglements, there was no reason to maintain contact with someone who had systematically betrayed my trust on multiple levels. "What about Vanessa?" Elena's tone was carefully neutral. I smiled slightly. "Funny you should ask. I ran into her at the grocery store in Harrisburg last week." Elena's eyebrows shot up. "And? Was it awful?" Surprisingly, no, it was. Awkward, certainly, but not hostile. She seemed genuinely embarrassed to see me. I took a sip of tea, recalling the encounter. She actually apologized, said she'd had no idea I was caring for my sister when she moved into the lake house, that Robert had told her we were separated and I was staying with family in Seattle while we finalized the divorce. Elena shook her head in disbelief. "He lied to her too, then." "What did you say?" I told her I appreciated her apology, but that my issues were with Robert, not with her. I smiled ruefully. I may have also mentioned that the property records for the Philadelphia house might be worth checking, given his history of financial deception. Elena laughed out loud. "Catherine Harlow, that is deliciously strategic revenge without being petty." "I'm impressed." I shrugged, smiling. "Just sharing information between women. If she's planning a future with him, she deserves to know exactly what she's getting." The encounter with Vanessa had been unexpectedly cathartic, a final confirmation that the anger I'd initially directed at her had always belonged squarely with Robert. She was, in many ways, as much a victim of his manipulations as I had been, albeit in different circumstances. "Speaking of the future," Elena said, changing the subject, "have you given any more thought to Taylor's invitation?" The invitation in question had arrived last week, an offer from Taylor James, the landscape architect who owned the region's most successful design firm, to collaborate on a major project in Philadelphia. We had met at a professional conference in October, and our conversation about sustainable urban landscaping had evolved into occasional professional consultations, and, more recently, this potential partnership. "I'm still considering it," I replied. "The project is fascinating, and working with Taylor would be an incredible opportunity. But it would mean spending significant time in Philadelphia over the next year." "Which brings up complicated feelings," Elena suggested perceptively. I nodded. "Part of me worries about stepping back into Robert's orbit, even peripherally. Philadelphia still feels associated with that chapter of my life." "That's understandable," Elena said. "But consider this. Reclaiming Philadelphia as a place where you do meaningful professional work could be powerful. It transforms the city from where my marriage ended to where my career expanded." Her reframing resonated deeply. Throughout the divorce process, I had been learning to distinguish between avoiding painful situations and creating strategic boundaries. The former was rooted in fear, the latter in self-respect and clarity about my priorities. "You're right," I acknowledged. "And the project aligns perfectly with the direction I want to take Lakeview Landscapes, incorporating more urban renewal and sustainability elements." The conversation drifted to other topics as evening deepened around us. After Elena left, I remained in the living room, watching darkness settle over the lake while contemplating the decision about Taylor's project. The opportunity represented exactly the kind of career advancement I had subtly been discouraged from pursuing during my marriage: high profile, demanding, and requiring significant confidence in my professional abilities. My phone chimed with a text from Melissa. "Thinking of you today. 6 months since you found out. How are you really doing?" The message caught me off guard. I had been so focused on the practical aspects of rebuilding my life, the renovations, the business development, the legal proceedings, that I hadn't marked the significance of the date. 6 months since I'd discovered Vanessa in my kitchen. Half a year since the life I thought I had shattered around me. I composed a thoughtful reply. Better than I could have imagined back then. Building something new that feels authentic and exciting. The pain hasn't disappeared, but it's no longer the central force in my life. Melissa's response came quickly. That's what healing looks like. Not absence of scars, but freedom from being defined by them. Her words captured exactly what I'd been working toward in therapy with Sarah. Not some impossible return to who I had been before Robert's betrayal, but integration of that experience into a stronger, more self-aware version of myself. As I prepared for bed that night, I found myself drawn to the small wooden box I'd placed on my bedside table, my mother's jewelry box, which I'd retrieved from storage after the divorce was finalized. Inside were the few pieces of her jewelry that had been returned to me as part of the settlement. Robert had apparently sold the most valuable items, but overlooked this box with its less obviously precious contents. Among them was a simple silver chain with a pendant shaped like a seedling breaking through soil, a gift from my father to my mother when she had started her landscape design business 30 years ago. The accompanying card, which she had kept all those years, read simply, "For new growth after difficult seasons." I held the pendant in my palm, feeling a profound connection across time, to my mother who had built her own business while raising 2 daughters, to the younger version of myself who had watched her balance determination with grace, to the woman I was becoming now, finding my own path through a landscape altered by loss. Tomorrow's meeting with the resort developers represented just one of many crossroads I would face in this new chapter of my life. Each decision, whether to take Taylor's project, how to expand my business, when to date again, if ever, would shape the emerging contours of a life that was solely mine to design. The thought was no longer terrifying as it had been in those first raw days after discovering Robert's betrayal. Instead, it felt like standing on the edge of a vast, uncharted territory. Challenging, certainly, but filled with possibilities I had only begun to imagine. I fastened my mother's pendant around my neck, a tangible reminder of resilience across generations. Whatever tomorrow brought, whether success with the resort contract or disappointment, whether I ultimately accepted Taylor's Philadelphia project or created a different opportunity, I would face it with the clarity and strength I had discovered during these months of reconstruction. The betrayal that had seemed like an ending had revealed itself as a difficult but necessary transition. The marriage I thought would last a lifetime had, in fact, lasted exactly as long as it needed to. Long enough to bring me to this place, of greater self-knowledge and purpose, but not so long that I remained trapped in a relationship built on illusion and compromise. As I drifted toward sleep, I thought about the dock Elena and I had admired earlier, how its solid presence extending into the lake represented my growing willingness to venture beyond safe shores. The woman who had arrived at this house 6 months ago shattered by betrayal and uncertain of her future, had been transformed through conscious choices, difficult work, and the steady support of true friends. That transformation wasn't complete, might never be complete, as growth was, an ongoing process rather than a destination. But standing at the 6-month marker between my old life and whatever came next, I recognized the quiet miracle of having rebuilt not just a house, but a sense of self that no betrayal could ever again so thoroughly dismantle. The winter would bring challenges, practical obstacles like maintaining the dock against ice damage, professional hurdles as I expanded my business, emotional terrain still to be navigated. But with each decision made solely according to my own values, each success achieved through my own efforts, the foundation of my new life grew stronger. 6 months ago, I had lost a husband but found myself. The property deed that had given me legal ownership of the lake house had, in a profound way, also granted me ownership of my future. A deed to possibilities I was only now beginning to fully explore. Whatever Robert and Vanessa were building, together no longer concerned me. My focus had shifted entirely to the architecture of a life designed with integrity, purpose, and newfound wisdom. As snow continued to fall softly outside my window, I made a silent promise to the woman I had become through this crucible of betrayal and recovery. I would never again make myself smaller to accommodate someone else's limitations. I would never again mistake compromise of core values for love. I would never again surrender my dreams to preserve an illusion of security. These promises weren't made in bitterness or anger, but in the calm clarity that comes with hard-won self-knowledge. Robert's betrayal had torn away the comfortable fictions of my marriage, forcing me to confront truths I had long avoided, about him, about our relationship, and most importantly, about myself. The gift hidden within that painful unveiling was the freedom to build something authentic on the cleared ground where those illusions had once stood. Not a life defined by reaction to betrayal, but one created through deliberate choice and growing confidence in my own vision. Tomorrow, I would present my designs to the resort developers, possibly take another step toward professional expansion. Next week, I would decide about Taylor's Philadelphia project. Next month, next year, next decade. Each stretch of time now, open to possibilities limited only by my courage to pursue them. The last thought before sleep claimed me was simple but profound. The most beautiful gardens often emerge from ground that has been thoroughly cleared, allowing new growth to flourish without the constraints of what came before. In the landscape of my life, the painful clearing had been completed. The season of new growth had already begun.